They once ruled nearly a quarter of the entire world. Maps were covered in red. The sun never set on their power. But one rainy night in 1997, the final flag came down. No invasion, no great battle, just silence. How did a small island rise to control continents, and then slowly let it all slip away? This is the rise and fall of the British Empire. In 1947, under a burning Indian sky, the Union Jack was lowered. Millions watched in silence. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the world was breaking apart. But this was only the beginning of the end. Crowds filled the streets of Delhi. Some were cheering, some were crying, some were just afraid. The British Empire, the empire people once said the sun never set on, was losing its brightest jewel. How did it come to this? How did a small, rainy island in the cold North Atlantic rise to control lands across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific, only to watch it all slowly slip away? To understand the fall, we must first go back to the beginning. In the late 1500s, England wasn't the strongest country in Europe. Spain ruled the seas. France had great armies. The Ottoman Empire stretched across continents. England was small, often poor, and surrounded by danger. But it had something powerful: ships. In 1588, when the massive Spanish Armada sailed to invade, England was terrified. But their smaller, faster ships attacked, retreated, and struck again. Storms scattered the Spanish fleet. When the smoke cleared, England had survived. It was a turning point. The sea would become England's weapon. Over the next century, English ships sailed farther and farther. They reached North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. In 1600, a group of merchants formed the East India Company. At first, they only wanted spices, silk, and tea. But trade slowly turned into control. Ports became forts. Forts became cities. Cities became territories. And territories became an empire. By the 1700s, Britain was no longer just England. It had joined with Scotland to form Great Britain, and its navy grew stronger every year. Across the ocean, 13 colonies in North America flew British flags. In India, British traders were becoming political rulers. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations created enormous wealth. Gold, cotton, tea, tobacco, all these goods flowed into London. This money built factories, powering the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines roared to life. Railways stretched across the land. Britain became the workshop of the world. Its navy protected trade routes across the oceans. Its language, laws, and flags spread everywhere. But then came a shocking loss. In 1776, the American colonies declared independence. The United States was born. It was a huge blow. How could the empire lose such rich land? But instead of collapsing, Britain adapted. It turned its focus more strongly toward Asia and Africa. In 1815, after defeating Napoleon at Waterloo, Britain stood at the absolute top of global power. No rival navy could match it. The 1800s became the age of empire. Red spread across world maps: red for British territory, Canada, Australia, large parts of Africa, India, Hong Kong, islands across the Caribbean and Pacific. Nearly 1/4 of the world's population lived under British rule. People said, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because somewhere in its vast lands, the sun was always shining. But power comes with a cost. In India, the East India Company ruled over millions. In 1857, Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, rebelled. The uprising shook the empire to its core. For months, fighting spread across northern India. The British were shocked. They never expected such fierce resistance. When it finally ended, the East India Company was dissolved. India came under the direct rule of the British Crown, and Queen Victoria became Empress of India. The empire tightened its grip. Railways were built. Telegraph lines stretched across continents. But beneath the surface of so-called progress, anger and questions were growing. Was the empire bringing progress or just control? Opportunity or exploitation? In Africa, European nations competed fiercely for territory. At the Berlin Conference in 1884, European leaders literally divided the African continent on maps, often without asking the people who actually lived there. Britain gained vast territories: Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya. Its power looked unstoppable. London became the center of global finance and trade. Huge ships filled its ports. Parliament debated laws that affected millions across the globe. But cracks were forming. In Ireland, calls for independence grew louder. In India, leaders began demanding self-rule. In Africa, resistance movements slowly took shape. Then came 1914, a war unlike any before it. World War I. Britain entered the conflict to defend its allies. Millions of soldiers from across the empire fought, from India, Canada, Australia, and Africa. The war lasted 4 terrible years. When it ended, Britain had won, but at a staggering cost. Cities were damaged, the treasury was drained, and an entire generation of young men was lost. On paper, the empire had even expanded, gaining former German and Ottoman territories. But in reality, it was weaker than it looked. Then, in 1939, the world went to war again. World War II was even more devastating. Bombs rained down on London during the Blitz. Food was rationed. Factories worked day and night. Once again, soldiers from across the empire fought. And once again, Britain stood against enormous danger and survived. But survival came at a price. Britain was exhausted, deeply in debt, and dependent on help from the United States. Meanwhile, in India, the independence movement had grown unstoppable. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi called for freedom through peaceful, non-violent resistance. Millions joined the cause. The message was clear: the empire could not last forever. By the end of World War II, Britain still had territory all across the globe, but it no longer had the strength or the will to hold it all. In 1947, India gained independence. The empire's brightest jewel was gone. Crowds celebrated freedom, but the partition of India and Pakistan also brought unimaginable fear, migration, and tragedy. The empire was shrinking fast. In the years that followed, colonies across Africa and Asia pushed for their own independence. Some transitions were peaceful, others were tense and complicated. But one by one, nations became free. The map that had once been so overwhelmingly red began to change. By the 1960s, the British Empire was largely dissolved. What remained was the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations. Britain was no longer the ruler of a quarter of the world. It was still a powerful country, yes, but not an empire. And this brings us to the question that haunts history. Did the empire fall because others grew stronger? Or did its own weight simply become too heavy to carry? In quiet archives and old government papers, historians still debate the decisions made behind closed doors. They talk about financial struggles, political pressure, and the changing ideas about freedom and self-rule that swept the globe. The fall wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, gradual unraveling, a sun that slowly set. But there is one hidden truth that many people overlook. A turning point not just in India, just in Africa, but at the very heart of Britain itself. A decision was made after World War II that changed everything. A decision that admitted something powerful and shocking. Britain could no longer afford its empire. And once that truth was accepted, there was no going back. Next, we'll uncover the secret meetings, the rising independence movements, and the global forces that made the greatest empire in history quietly let go of the world. Because the fall of the British Empire wasn't just about lost land, it was about a world that had changed forever. The empire did not collapse in one loud explosion. It cracked, quietly, slowly, and sometimes in rooms where no cameras were allowed. After World War II, Britain was tired. The war had drained its money. Cities were damaged. Families were grieving. The country owed huge debts to the United States. On paper, Britain still ruled vast lands. But behind closed doors, leaders knew the truth. They could not afford to hold the empire together anymore. In India, pressure was rising fast. For decades, Indians had demanded more control over their own government. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru had built powerful movements calling for independence. Protests filled the streets. Strikes stopped railways. Ordinary people refused to cooperate with British rule. The message was clear: the empire's authority was weakening. In London, Prime Minister Clement Attlee faced a difficult decision. Should Britain try to hold India by force, or should it step away? The world was watching. After 2 world wars, many people believed the age of empires should end. In 1947, Britain made its choice. India would become independent, but freedom came with a painful cost. The land was divided into 2 nations, India and Pakistan. Millions of people had to move across new borders. Families were separated. Communities changed overnight. The British flag was lowered. The empire's brightest jewel was gone. And once India was gone, their colonies began to believe their time had come too. In Southeast Asia, Burma gained independence in 1948. In the Middle East, Britain's influence weakened as new nations formed. In Africa, a new generation of leaders began demanding freedom. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, many others across the continent. These leaders had seen Britain fight for freedom during the World Wars. Now, they asked a simple question: if freedom is good for Europe, why not for us? In 1956, a crisis shook Britain's confidence: the Suez Crisis. Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway for global trade. Britain, along with France and Israel, planned a secret operation to regain control. They believed they could act like they once had: strong, decisive, in charge. But this time, something was different. The United States did not support them. The Soviet Union threatened consequences. Global pressure mounted. Under intense political and economic strain, Britain withdrew. It was a stunning moment. For the first time in centuries, Britain realized it could not act alone on the world stage. The Suez Crisis showed the world that the empire's power was no longer absolute. It was a turning point. From that moment on, independence movements moved faster. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence from Britain. The celebrations were joyful. The message spread across Africa like wildfire: if Ghana could do it, others could too. Throughout the 1960s, nation after nation gained freedom. Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi. Each independence ceremony marked the lowering of the Union Jack and the raising of a new national flag. Britain began to shift its identity. Instead of empire, it spoke of partnership. Instead of control, it spoke of cooperation. The Commonwealth of Nations grew, a group of independent countries linked by history, trade, and shared institutions. But questions lingered. Did Britain leave because it believed in freedom, or because it had no other choice? The economy at home was changing. Factories that once powered the Industrial Revolution were aging. Other countries, like the United States and Germany, were growing stronger. The world's balance of power was shifting. And then there was Hong Kong. In 1898, Britain had leased Hong Kong from China for 99 years. As the 1997 deadline approached, negotiations began. What would happen next? In 1984, Britain and China signed an agreement. Hong Kong would return to China in 1997. On the night of July 1, 1997, the British flag was lowered once more. Rain fell gently during the ceremony. Prince Charles stood in silence. The last governor left Government House. With that moment, Britain's last major overseas colony was gone. The empire that once ruled across continents had officially ended. Yet something remained. English was still spoken worldwide. British laws and institutions shaped governments across former colonies. Trade networks continued. Cultural ties endured. The empire was gone, but its influence remained. And here is the deeper mystery. Empires in history often fall through invasion or destruction. The Roman Empire collapsed under attack. The Ottoman Empire dissolved after war. But the British Empire did something unusual. It stepped back. It handed over power, not always perfectly, without tension, but often through negotiation. Why? Was it moral change, financial reality, political pressure, or the realization that the modern world had no place for old-style empires? Inside British government archives, historians have found letters and reports showing deep concern about the cost of maintaining distant territories. Military expenses were high, local resistance was growing, international opinion was changing, the age of empire was ending, and Britain chose to adapt rather than collapse. But even as the empire faded, something unexpected happened. Britain faced a new challenge not overseas. At home, immigration from former colonies increased. People from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa moved to Britain, helping rebuild the country after the war. They brought culture, music, food, and new ideas. Britain itself was changing. The empire had once spread British identity across the world. Now, the world was shaping Britain. Some welcomed this change. Others struggled with it. Debates about identity, belonging, and history grew stronger. And in quiet corners of the country, a difficult question remained. Was the empire something to be proud of, or something to examine more closely? The rise of the British Empire had shaped the modern world. Its fall reshaped it again. But as we move into the final chapter, one final question stands above all others. If the empire ended decades ago, why does its shadow still influence global politics, borders, language, and power today? The empire may have fallen, but its story is not over. Because sometimes, the end of power is only the beginning of a new kind of influence. Next, we uncover how the legacy of the British Empire still shapes the world in ways many people do not even realize. The empire is gone. The red on the map has faded. The flags have changed. But look closer. The story did not end when the last colony became independent. It changed form. In 1997, as the rain fell over Hong Kong and the Union Jack was lowered, many believed that was the final page of the empire's story. But history does not close so easily. Because empires do not only leave behind land, they leave behind systems, languages, borders, ideas, and sometimes problems that take generations to understand. Today, English is one of the most spoken languages in the world. It is used in business, science, aviation, diplomacy, and the internet. From Canada to Australia, from India to Nigeria, the language of a small island became global. Why? Because the empire carried it across oceans. Legal systems in many former colonies are based on British common law. Parliamentary systems across the world mirror the model built in Westminster. Railway lines built during colonial times still connect cities in India and Africa. Ports first expanded for imperial trade remain vital today. The empire shaped the structure of the modern world. But the shadow is complex. In some regions, colonial borders were drawn without considering ethnic groups, languages, or histories. Lines were placed on maps in distant conference rooms. Sometimes those lines later became sources of tension. Historians continue to study how these decisions shaped modern politics. In Britain itself, the memory of empire is debated. Some remember it as a time of global influence and industrial power. Others focus on the inequalities and struggles that came with colonial rule. Museums hold artifacts from across the world. Some ask, how did they arrive there? Universities teach about trade, expansion, and resistance movements. Films and books explore both pride and pain. The empire is part of Britain's identity, but it is not a simple story. And then there is the Commonwealth. More than 50 independent countries remain connected through this voluntary association. They share history, language, and cooperation in areas like education and sport. The Commonwealth Games bring athletes together. Diplomats meet under shared frameworks. It is not an empire, but it is a reminder of shared pasts. Meanwhile, Britain's own path has shifted again. In 2016, the country voted to leave the European Union. Some voices spoke of global Britain return to worldwide trade connections, a reminder of maritime history. Others argued the future lay in new partnerships, not old memories. The debate showed something powerful. The empire may have ended, but its memory still shapes how Britain sees itself, and how others see Britain. In former colonies, the story is equally layered. India is now one of the world's largest economies. Nigeria is a cultural powerhouse in music and film. Australia and Canada are strong independent nations. These countries are not defined only by colonial history, but that history is part of their foundation. Sometimes celebrated, sometimes questioned, always studied. And here is the quiet truth. The British Empire did not vanish in flames. It did not collapse overnight. It transformed. It dissolved piece by piece. Through negotiation, through pressure, through global change. It adapted because the world demanded something new. The age of empires gave way to the age of nations. But the human story remains. Ambition, innovation, conflict, cooperation. The same forces that built the empire also reshaped the world after it. In London today, ships no longer carry imperial goods across oceans under royal command, but global finance flows through its banks. In former colonies, new skylines rise where colonial offices once stood. Young generations learn history not as rulers or subjects, but as citizens of independent nations. And so we return to that powerful image. The sun that never set. Was it a symbol of glory, or a reminder that no power lasts forever? Every empire in history has risen. Every empire has fallen. The British Empire rose from a small island with ships and ambition. It expanded across continents through trade, industry, and naval strength. It faced resistance, change, and world wars. And in the end, it chose transformation over destruction. The empire fell, but its shadow still shapes the modern world. Borders, languages, trade routes, political systems, global connections. The story of the British Empire is not just about Britain. It is about how the modern world was built. And here is the final question. If empires always rise and fall, what lessons does that leave for today's great powers? History does not repeat exactly, but it echoes. The British Empire's rise and fall reminds us that power is never permanent. Influence changes form, and the world never stands still. The sun may have set on the empire, but the light and the shadow remain. Before you scroll, do you think empires ever truly disappear? Comment your answer and subscribe for the next chapter.